A Brave Little Maid of New France by Hannah Bryant, taken from the book Courageous Girls. The historical facts for this story are to be found in Parkman's Frontenac and New France. In truth, my Madeleine, it is a temptation, and yet I fear to leave thee and thy brothers, Mignon. Mother and daughter sat in the low-ceilinged, heavy-beamed room of the Manor of Verchères in the year 1692. The hand of Madame de Verchères rested lightly on the dark curls of her 14-year-old daughter, seated on a low stool beside her, but her eyes gazed wistfully out of the window where the waters of the St. Lawrence could be seen flowing swiftly by, the clear blue of the Canadian sky above, the glory of late October painting the trees of the forest. The seigneury of Verchères was between Quebec and Montreal, though nearer the latter place, whither on the morrow a boat was to go to bring back supplies against the long cold winter. The temptation now offered to Madame de Verchères was to go in the boat for a few days' visit with her sister. Fear not for us. Are we not well and strong, and am I not old enough to care for my two brothers? 'Tis not that I doubt the discretion of thy great age, Madeleine, said her mother, with a little laugh, but with thy father away on his military service at Quebec, it seems not right for me, too, to leave thee and go in the other direction. 'Twill do thee good, dear little mother, and soon both thou and father will return, and we will settle down for a long, cold winter. Ooh, how the thought of it makes me shiver. I can hear the branches of the forest snapping with the cold, louder than the guns of the Iroquois. Would it not be fine, dear mother, if instead of father's coming home, when his military duty is over, the governor should appoint him to be one of the gentlemen of his household, and we should all go to Quebec for the winter? Oh, how thou wouldst shine at the balls and routs, my beautiful mother, and how gaily would I dance with the other children of the governor's court, and see almost the glories of the king at Versailles. Foolish child, thy wild dreams run away with thee. Now listen, Madeleine. If I go, and any illness comes, or aught goes amiss, wilt thou send for our neighbor, Madame Fontaine? Oh, mother dear, I had rather trust to the simple medicines of the old squaw. Truly, Madame Fontaine is so timid, as are all women just come from Paris, and old Ananata is far wiser than she. Thou mayest safely trust us here, and thou wilt go, wilt thou not? As I said at the first, 'tis a temptation to make the journey ere the winter shuts us in. And perchance I can persuade Tante Madeleine to return with me for the winter. This is the 20th of October. Yes, I will go, and stay but for the days of All Saints and All Souls. Yet tell me, Madeleine. Madeleine said, the mother's anxiety again gaining control. Tell me, if the Iroquois should come, what couldst thou do? Why, truly, none knowest better than thou, brave little mother, that the best way to meet them is with boldness. So, if the Iroquois should come, cried the girl, springing up and seizing a light cane standing in the corner, I would point my gun at him, so, and then bang, I would say, Avant, Monsieur Iroquois, and off he would go. Preparations for a journey in those days were simple, and the next morning Madame de Verchères waved a farewell from the boat, as it slipped away against the current, to her children who had come down to the landing to see her off. Madeleine stood between her two little brothers, her arms thrown across their shoulders, and close behind them stood an old serving-man, L'Évolué, his white hair blowing in the fresh morning breeze. When the boat had passed from sight, they turned from the landing and made their way back to where the fort stood, encircled by a high stockade, although a leaning post here and there showed that it was not of recent building. Within the stockade stood a blockhouse, stronger fortified, with bastions at each corner, as there were also at the corners of the fort. The place showed that it had been planned by a military man. Its general air of defense showed that it was built with the thought of an ever-possible enemy, yet a certain air of relaxed vigilance showed that at present, at least, the possible enemy was not considered a probable one. Madeleine played games of soldier with the boys, drilling them thoroughly and planning delightful ambuscades in the odd nooks of the fort and the covered way which connected it with the block house, until the short autumn day came to an end. Soon after sunset the gate was closed and barred, and before long all were asleep. While the pines of the forest whispered their lullaby, the waters of the St. Lawrence splashed and murmured throughout the night, and the hoot of the owls sounded, now on this side, now on that. When morning dawned, it was another clear October day. The habitants were early at work in the fields. Some of the soldiers, there were but a handful at the fort, went into the woods hunting. Two of their number, La Bonnet and Gush, were left behind, sorely against their will, but the Seigneur de Verchères was strict in his military discipline, and even in his absence the soldiers dared not leave the fort wholly unguarded, in spite of the apparent peace. So, as the lot fell upon these two men, they stayed, though with an ill grace. Madeleine, leaving her two brothers at play within the fort, went again to the river landing, attended by Le Volet, hoping that some passing canoe might bring some message from her father in Quebec, or of her mother's safe arrival in Montreal. Le Volet, having provided himself with a pole and line, stood placidly fishing, while Madeleine, seated on the edge of the little wharf, idly watched him. On the side of the river on which they were, the land was cleared for quite a distance in both directions. In the fertile meadows on the river's bank, the settlers could be seen at work, while nearer the fort stretched in a line the cottages of the inhabitants. On the other side the forest rose in its primeval beauty, the dark pines mingling with the brilliant red and yellow foliage of the trees. Suddenly from the borders of the fields, where the men were working, came the sudden sharp crack of a gun. A habitant fell, then another. The quiet air was rent with the shriek of the piercing war-whoops, and from the woods which bordered the clearing burst a troop of Indians, hideous in their war-paint. "Quick, mademoiselle, the Iroquois! They are upon us!" cried Le Volet, and seizing her arm, they fled together for the fort, fortunately for them a straight path, and not a long one. The light feet of the young girl and the long strides of the old man, who had been a famous runner in his youth, covered the ground so rapidly that the Indians soon saw that they could not capture the fugitives alive before the fort was reached. So they stopped in their headlong pursuit and began firing. To the terrified girl, with the bullets singing round her ears, the way seemed very long, and that her flying feet scarcely moved. "Father in heaven, save me, save us all," she prayed, and at last reached the gate of the fort. Her two brothers, with grave, anxious faces, ran to meet her. "Oh, Madeleine, thou art safe. We thought thou wouldst be killed. Oh, if father were here! Tell us, sister, what shall we do?" "We will hold the fort for the king, as father would," she said bravely. "Listen well, boys, to what I say. Father says a French fort must never fall into the hands of the Iroquois, for if they capture one, they will think they can take all, and it will make them more bold and insolent and daring. Now you must each take a gun, and I will take one too, and we shall be such brave soldiers that the enemy will think we are many in the garrison instead of so few." "But, Madeleine, Alexander cannot have a gun," Louis exclaimed, all the jealousy of the elder brother aroused. Father said when he had La Bonnet teach him to shoot that he was quite too young to be trusted with a gun alone. Listen, Louise, Madeleine said, so gravely that the boy's petty resentment died away. Alexander may be too young to use a gun for sport, but this is not sport. It is a matter of life and death. And her face paled as she remembered that neither her girlhood nor the youth of the brave lads facing her would protect them if they fell into the enemy's hands. Remember that Father has always taught you that gentlemen are born to shed their blood for the service of God and King. During this time, the Indians had withdrawn. One would almost have thought the sudden sharp onset had been some evil dream, that the only reality was the clear, crisp morning, with its floods of sunshine, and that all danger was over. But none of the Canadian pioneers were to be deceived by such seeming security. They knew the Iroquois' habits, and that such retreat was but the lull before the fiercer storm. Child though she was, Madeleine de Verchères seized this respite to do what could be done to prepare a fierce attack. Hurrying on with the boys to the blockhouse, she found women and children who had rushed there from their cottages for safety, huddled together, some of them rocking to and fro in a silent agony of grief, but most of them crying and screaming at the top of their lungs in a panic of fear. "Hush, oh hush," she begged. "Be still. Your clamor can be heard afar, and if the Iroquois should hear, they would know by your crying how frightened you are, and that would make them more bold. They are always afraid to attack a fort they think well defended, and we must make them believe we have 100 soldiers here." Then, flashing upon them a smile, which from her babyhood had won all hearts to do her bidding, she added, more gently, "We must all be brave together. You must pray, my brothers, and I will fight like men, and help will soon come." Then she left them, and went below to the place where the ammunition was stored. Here she found the 2 soldiers left behind by the hunting party, one hiding in a corner, and the other, with a lighted match in his hand, making his way towards where the powder was stored. "Gachet!" she called so suddenly that he dropped the match. "What are you doing?" "Light the powder and blow us all up out of the hands of those heathen," he answered. "You miserable coward," she cried, stomping her foot on the match until the spark was quenched. "Are you a fool? Think you that I, the daughter of Seigneur of Verchères, would give up this fort while one of us remains to defend it? You are coward. You're both cowards. Come out of here and help me do what must be done." Followed by them, she made the rounds of the stockade, finding several places where the 10-foot posts had fallen on the ground, leaving breaches by which the enemy could enter without hindrance. Tugging at the posts herself, helping to lift them with her brother's aid, while the men dug new holes, settled the posts, and tamped them firmly into place. Madeleine at last felt that all had been done that could be to make the outer defenses secure. Laboulaye, who had mounted the bastion near the gate and was keeping a close watch on field and river, now reported a canoe coming rapidly towards the landing, containing Fontaine family seeking refuge in the fort. Madeleine called the 2 soldiers and asked one of them to go to meet the little party of refugees, but both held back, making the excuse that it was their duty to stay within the fort and not leave it without military protection. "Cowards!" flashed Madeleine. "Then I shall go myself." "No, no, mademoiselle," hastily interrupted old Laboulaye. "Let me go. I cannot see my seigneur's daughter go unprotected." "Not so, my good Laboulaye," she answered. "We can spare but one from our small force in case anything happens, and you are far more valuable here than I, for you have a cool head to direct them, and have stood a siege before. The others are but frightened sheep. Then, as her little brother clung to her, begging her not to go, she said cheerily, "There isn't as much danger as you think, dear boys. If the Indians see the gate of the fort open, and one from within going calmly to meet the newcomers, they will feel that our numbers are strong, and that it is a ruse to tempt them to come over to attack us, and that while they are rushing upon us, a force from the fort will come out and destroy them." Laboulaye nodded his head gravely. "Mademoiselle has read the mind of the Iroquois. That is what they will think," he agreed. "Else would I never suffer her to go alone. Stand here at the gate, little brothers, with guns cocked, and Laboulaye will keep good watch from the bastion, and when we reach that white stone just there, open the gate, that there may be no delay in our entering. Au revoir." And slipping through the gate, she walked down the path and met the refugees near the river bank, and they walked back to the fort as calmly and boldly as they could, not daring to run. Although no shots were fired at them, they felt that they were watched by far-seeing, cruel, unfriendly eyes, and once again, as Madeleine said in her latter days, the time seemed very long. It was with thankful hearts that they passed within the stockade gate, and the heavy beams which barred it were swung into place after them. That afternoon the respite continued, but when the early autumn twilight settled down, the weather changed suddenly. The wind rose, and mingled with the wailings came the sound of shots from the forest, while the anxious watchers peered through the fast-gathering darkness, saw shadowy forms flitting from tree to tree, drawing nearer the fort. An anxious little group assembled within the blockhouse for a hurried council of war. "They are drawing nearer and nearer," Madeleine said. "You think that they plan to attack us tonight, Monsieur Fontaine?" "I fear so," he answered anxiously, while old Laboulaye nodded his head in assent. "It is their way, you know," he continued, "to slip up by degrees, and with shrieks and yells that help by terrifying the besieged storm the walls and capture the stockade, if possible. Then heaven help those who they capture, or who surrender." "I know," Madeleine said gravely, "but they fear to attack a place they think well defended. Our hope lies in making them think we are many. Even if they took the fort, the blockade could be held until help came. Therefore, it is there that you strong men are most needed to guard the helpless women and children, whatever befalls us. Do you, Monsieur Fontaine, with Labonnet and Gachet, guard well that place, and oh, do not give up, even if I am taken before your eyes." "Heaven forbid!" cried Fontaine fervently, but Laboulaye nodded gravely. "She has the mind of a general. She has planned well," he said. They parted, Fontaine and the two soldiers going to the blockhouse, while the old men, the little maid, and the two lads took their places in the bastions on the stockades. And at the frequent and regular intervals the call, "All's well," sounded. Pierre Fontaine had a clever trick of throwing his voice from one place to another, and such variety did this lend to their signals that Madeleine joyfully said to herself, "The place seems full of soldiers." The wind increased in fierceness as night drew on. An icy rain fell, changing latter to snow, which soon whitened the ground. This was an advantage, for it made it possible to see, in what would otherwise have been impenetrable darkness, a black mass of moving creatures approaching the fort. Madeleine was straining her eyes to see if this was some new scheme of the Indians to approach the fort unchallenged, when a comfortable, everyday moo sounded from the mass, made her laugh aloud. So great was the relief from the tension. At the same moment she heard a low whistle from Lavolée, the signal agreed upon to call the four to any given point. When she reached his bastion, he said in a low tone, "Here comes the poor cattle which escaped from the Indians this afternoon. The Iroquois have feasted well on some of the beasts this night. Shall I open the gate and let our poor creatures in?" "Oh, I am afraid," she cried. "The Indians may be there." "Oh, nonsense, Madeleine," interposed her brother Louise. "I know that was our Barbie mooing." "Even so, Louise," returned Madeleine fearfully, "but thou knowest not all the tricks of the Indians. They may be cowering in among the cattle to slip within our walls." "I think we may safely venture," said Lavolée cautiously. "The Indians have had a great feast tonight. They have held some kind of council, too, I think, from the shouts and songs I have heard. I can still see gleams of their council fire afar off among those trees. I think, as their wont is at such times, they have gorged until they can eat no more, and must sleep tonight." So, most cautiously, while the two boys held their guns cocked, Madeleine opened the gates just enough to allow one cow at a time to slip through. When the last of the animals had entered, and the gate was again barred, they were back, each to his bastion, leaving the cows to find such shelter as they could under the rude sheds built here and there within the enclosure. This incident broke the monotony of the long vigil for the boys, and brought some comfort to Madeleine, for she knew that now there would be plenty of milk for the little children crowded within the blockhouse, and even fresh meat for the older ones, should the siege be prolonged enough to make it necessary. When morning dawned, all the terrors of the night seemed to flee away. There are few things in the world that look quite as black in morning sunshine as in midnight gloom. A great sorrow, a great shame, may seem perchance to cast a deeper shadow when the sun shines, but not the physical terror which walks in darkness. Madeleine sent the two little boys to bed after the weary watch they had kept so faithfully, but she herself, borne up by a nervous excitement, seemed to feel no fatigue, and was here, there, and everywhere. Her laugh and smile so contagious that even the sad-faced women took courage, all save Madame Fontaine, who threw herself into her husband's arms, begging him to take her away back to France, to another fort anyway, to leave this horrible place. "Never," Pierre Fontaine replied. "Never will I desert this fort unless Madeleine surrenders it." "That will I never do," she cried, "for my father says that one French fort surrendered is one broken link in the glorious chain that holds this country for our beloved king." So the days passed on, no hour without its need for constant watchfulness, no night without its weary vigil. Many the alarms, attacks, the scattered shots from fort and forest. Yet, through it all, this brave little maid of New France bore herself most courageously, and never for one moment did those who seemed dependent upon her, and who had learned to lean upon her, see anything but a brave smile, or hear anything but words of cheer. But discouraged moments came to her nevertheless. A siege of moderate length she knew they were prepared to stand. Most of the winter provisions were stored in the blockhouse, and a fair supply of ammunition, although the boat which had carried her mother to Montreal was expected to bring back more powder, as well as cloth for the winter's use. But gradually, as day followed day, Madeleine's heart sank within her. Had the hunting party of soldiers been wholly destroyed? Had not even one escaped to make his way to Quebec and bring back help? Especially as the days grew nearer to the time her mother had set for her return, did a wild terror seize her, lest the beloved mother should return all unknowingly and be slain before her eyes. She had gone to her father's house to be alone there for a few minutes, and to wrestle with the terror and discouragement which had laid hold upon her. In the room where she and her mother had talked less than 2 weeks before, she laid her gun upon the table, and throwing her arms across it, bowed her head upon them, and gave way to heavy sobs, which shook her from head to foot. "Oh, dear Father in heaven, if my earthly father knew the danger his little girl was in, he would send help most speedily," she prayed. "Hold thou my dear mother safe, guard her and guide her. Keep her from coming back until all is safe again. O do thou, who knowest all, and who lovest more than an earthly father, send deliverance, I pray thee, for we are sore beset." There came upon the tired child suddenly a great calm, and a wave of peace seemed to pass over her, and she was not afraid nor anxious any more, and the heavy burdens she had been carrying seemed to roll away. For the first time in days she slept a deep, quiet sleep, whether for moments or hours she could not tell. Suddenly, as often happens when some slight, unusual noise occurs, she roused, conscious that the sentinel's regular "all's well" had changed to the quick "qui vive" of challenge. A moment later, Louise de Verchères, whom Madeleine had charged to summon her if the slightest change occurred, came to her calling, "Madeleine, Madeleine, come quickly! Help has come at last!" Even in this supreme moment, her girlish love of fun showed itself, for she snatched an old military hat of her father's and placed it on her dark, curly hair. Then she ran lightly across the enclosure and up into the bastion, where faithful old Lavilette stood shaking and trembling with eagerness. "We must make quite sure, Lavilette, that this is not a ruse. It would not do to make a mistake now. Whence did the sound come? From the river." Then she sent her clear young voice ringing out into the night, just merging into the dim light of the dawn. "Qui vive? Qui vive?" And in answer came the call, "It is the Meunier, come to bring you aid." Oh, the welcome sound of the French tongue, and the well-known name. Posting Lavilette as sentinel at the gate, she herself went down to meet the lieutenant with his company of 40 men. A brave, quaint little figure she was, walking with stately steps, her girlish face half hidden by the military hat. Removing the hat with a stately sweeping bow, she said, as she went to meet them, "Verchères welcomes you and your men, Monsieur de la Meunier." "What memory is this?" cried the officer. "I expected to see the commander of the fort, and here comes to meet me a girl, pranked out as for a masquerade." "Even so, monsieur," she said, with quiet dignity. "The commander of the fort, it is I. Will you come with me?" Recalling with a thrill of gratitude the different circumstances under which she had traversed the path within 10 days, she walked confidently over it now, by the side of Monsieur de la Meunier. The tramp of soldiers' feet surrounded them on all sides. As they reached the white stone in the path, the gates of the fort swung open, showing old Lavilette and little 10-year-old Alexander standing as sentinels on either side. "Our oldest soldier and our youngest one, monsieur," said Madeleine as they presented arms. "Will it please you to inspect the fort?" Making the rounds with her, the Meunier found all in due military order, despite the pitifully small garrison. As they ended their rounds in the great room of the blockhouse, where the children crowded eagerly around to see the gold lace and brave uniform, the Meunier burst out enthusiastically. "It is wonderful, wonderful! Tell me now, Madeleine, how can we help you most?" "Post new sentinels at once, monsieur," she replied. "We have been on duty day and night for a week. It shall be done immediately. But first," he gave a low-toned order to his men, at which they formed in ranks. Then, with his hand open his heart, he bowed low before Madeleine, saying, "Great thanks and great glory are due to you, Mademoiselle de Verchères, for this most gallant defense. Then turning to his men, he cried in ringing tones, "Present arms?" The sensitive color rushed over the girl's face at this tribute, but she answered simply, raising her large dark eyes to La Meunier's face, "'Tis not, monsieur. I only did my duty. All thanks are due to la bonne Dieu, and the glory is our King's." The end.